So about 15 years ago, I had this employee at my elder law and special needs planning law office. Her name was Lori, and she was fantastic. She did all of our events and a lot of our marketing and did great communication. And at one point in time, my mom, who this podcast is dedicated to, worked for her. And I smile about that because they were like two peas in a pod. They both liked perfection. They had the same taste in decor. And so it worked really, really well for the events. But Lori worked for me and she just did a fabulous job. And there was this time where she just wasn't doing quite as well. And I could tell that she was overwhelmed. There was something wrong. And so, I asked her about it. And she basically let me know that she had been caregiving for her dad, who lived in Pittsburgh, which is about a 3 to 4 hour drive, depending on traffic from where we live. And so she was going to see him, trying to help him navigate his own journey. And she was caregiving for him, and that she was just tired, and she just couldn't keep up. Now, in our circumstance, everything was okay because she had a job where we could kind of curtail some of her events, maybe not plan quite as many. We could make her job just a little bit easier for a short time. It was kind of flexible. But that experience was really important for me as an employer because I was shocked about the fact that I had to go to her. She didn't come and tell me. And so it was one of those things that I've carried on as an employer to make sure that if somebody's not doing as good, that first I ask about, if they want to share what's going on in their personal life. And many times it comes back to caregiving for an aging parent.
So hey everybody, I'm Courtney and I'm here with my mom Julie, and we are here with the Hey Woman podcast, real conversations on caregiving, legacy, and love. And we dedicate this podcast to my nan, who passed just a little bit over a year ago. And we really talk about the caregiving journey and what we went through. And, we've done other episodes on grief, but we really want to talk about, because it is such a prevalent topic, which is how to deal with caregiving and employment. And this is something that affects over 50% of people. And so, we've done a little bit of research and lots of studies that have been done. And, this is something that affects so many people. And it really has lifelong impacts based on the decisions that you make right now when you're in the thick of caregiving, which isn't always the best time for deep decision making, right? Yeah. And so during our caregiving journey, or at least part of it, we were, I would say, a little bit fortunate that my mom owns her own practice. And, in the last couple of years, I was working for her. And so there was a better understanding of flexibility, although those tasks don't go away just because we were able to take off to go to doctor's appointments and different things like that. Doesn't mean that it was easy based on where we were. It just meant that we had the option to make decisions that worked for our lives. But now we're both managers of people. And, I was shocked by a study that we found that said over 50% of people who are caregiving don't tell their employer.
Yeah, it's crazy. We think about that, and I think, whether we had flexibility or not, I think everybody tries to keep doing everything that they're doing and then add this to it, add caregiving to their already full lives. And flexibility was helpful for us, but in some ways not, because we still just try to do everything.
Right.
So it took a while to say, okay, I can't do all of this. And I think that's what happens to many people. We just try to do everything, keep up with everything, when at some point in time we have to take a step back and say, okay, there's all these things to do. How do I get them done? It's interesting when I coach other attorneys and their staffs throughout the nation about time management and getting things done. One of the things I say to people is, just put everything on your calendar, take, an hour and just, close the door and take out a calendar and put everything you have to do on it. And if it doesn't fit, you have to get rid of something or delegate it. And that exercise would work right here in caregiving to say, okay, if I have to work a certain amount of hours, whatever that job is, I don't have those hours. And so if I now have to stop by and, make meals for my parent, if I have to take them to the doctor, any of those types of things, any caregiving things that I need to do, I need to understand that there's only so many hours in a day. And I think for many people, it kind of creeps up on them because it doesn't happen all at once. For some, it does. Some, there's like an event that occurs that makes life very different. But for some people, it's just like this slower decline, and you keep doing more and more and picking up more and more, and you don't even realize everything you're getting. So I think that's important for people to understand.
I also think, too, this is where the really, I would say, challenging notion of, you hear over and over again that caregiving is like raising kids. And this is one area where I think that thought process really is detrimental to people.
Agreed.
Because one, I think there's a better understanding amongst employers or coworkers or different things like that. Like there's this life event, right? You have a child. People know about it, especially if you're a woman, you go out on maternity leave, or a lot of men go on paternity leave now. And so there's kind of this like event, this announcement to everybody. It kind of happens. And then, but if your child gets sick, you take them to the doctor, and for the most part, the kid gets better. That's the hope really for everybody, right? When you're caring for an aging parent, there isn't always one defining moment where you're like, oh shit, this is going to get hard, and this is going to get hard for a long time. And when you're caring for a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or a parent, it can kind of creep up on you. And so there isn't this like loud pronouncement of like, oh, I just had a baby. Oh my God, I'm a caregiver. I also think, people don't always identify with the word because they're like, this is just what I'm doing. And so then it becomes this thing that you have to talk about. But also, unlike with a child, like you take the kid to the doctor and they get medicine and they get better. Whereas if you're caregiving, they don't always get better. And so it becomes a longer term thing that you have to learn how to fit into it with your life, which is why it's so important to kind of take a step back and think about, how did I get here and where do I want to go?
It's funny, Court, when you were saying, I agree with everything you said, but also children listen to you better.
They do.
At least my experience with caregiving is that my children listen to me better than my mom. And please know that I mean that with all due respect, because she was used to making her own decisions. She was used to, dealing with that whole idea of her declining independence, and that there was things that were happening that were taking away from her independence, which of course she's going to reel against. Where when you raise children, they're becoming more and more independent. And so they, it's kind of more of a natural thing. So I totally agree with you, but it's also, they don't always listen. But I think that this is, really important for us to be thinking about just how those differences are. And even when you were talking, I was thinking about, not only, but also with pregnancy, like, I remember I read, What to Expect When You're Expecting. I know that's an old book, but I'm sure many people in my generation read that same book. For 9 months, I was like reading about, well, how do I do this? What am I going to have to change in my life? And yet, often we don't plan. We don't do that. And what happens is, and I think, what the statistics say to me, and I'm just going to share some more of those statistics. These are from AARP. And Court talked about the fact that 53% of caregivers say their employers are not even aware of their caregiving. And I think the first thing we need to do is change that. But we can't tell people what to do in their own jobs because, of course, they know that environment better. I would hate for anybody to talk to their boss about it and have some retaliation or something, or some bad ramification. That shouldn't happen. But, the story I told about was a situation where, I have a law firm. I make those decisions. And Lori was a great long-term employee that, of course, I was going to be able to work with, but also her job was one that I was able to work with. And so, but it's really amazing to me. 50% have to go in late, leave early, or take time off for caregiving. 50%. That's amazing. That's so 50% of people who are caregiving, even in the early stages of caregiving, that's creeping into their work days. And of course, that's going to be like, you can't go to the doctor maybe, after work hours. 26.9% reduce their hours. And again, like, I think for me, the reason that these statistics are so alarming is not that it's necessary, but it's like how little there is out there to kind of deal with those types of things. And you talked about it in the very beginning. You said, the long-term ramifications. When people reduce their hours and make less money, obviously it's less money coming in, but it also can affect their Social Security benefits. It can also affect, maybe their pensions if they are to place at a pension. So many places go by your, top 10 years. And, maybe that person's actually in that time of their life that they would be in those little max earning years, maybe after they've raised their kids. And so the ramification isn't just now that I'm reducing my hours. It's also, how does that affect like my retirement benefits, my own plan? And that's why I come out really strongly that these conversations have to happen. And we've talked about it in other episodes, but it's also why I think, maybe people should take off of work, but maybe be paid for caregiving if they're in a situation where that's able to happen. And particularly when there's maybe 1 out of 3 children who are really picking this up and doing it day to day. Why shouldn't that one person, be, why shouldn't it be okay in our society for somebody to say, okay, I'm going to only work half-time, part-time at my regular job, and my other job is going to be caregiving, and I'm going to do it well, and I'm not going to be stressed, and I'm not going to be overwhelmed, and everything is going to fit in my calendar.
I also think too, one of the more like immediate things about reducing your work hours is, lots of times you have to be full time to get your benefits. So whether that's health insurance, dental, whether that's paid time off. So like in our office, you have to work 30 hours a week, which I think is, one of the lower for a full-time equivalent to get all of those benefits. So, I mean, just think if you would usually work 40 hours in a week. If you can take it down to 30 and keep all of your benefits, that savings of 10 hours is huge. But not every business is able to do it. And I'm not saying that we're perfectly set up to do this, right? There are obviously jobs that make that easier than others. And obviously you're losing the pay of those 10 hours, which, you talked about. But at least they're able to keep their health insurance. If you're a single parent or a single person and you don't have somebody else's health insurance to rely on, reducing your work hours may not be something that you're able to do, even if you wanted to, because there's a reality of needing health insurance for yourself. Because we all know the statistics about people that are caregiving and are in the thick of it, and they get sick themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and part of it is because, they're just trying to do everything, and the stress, is overwhelming. Yet, 31.8% of people have to take a leave of absence, completely, step away from their jobs for a while. 16.2% turn down promotions. And that's one of the things, like if you're caregiving, the business is going to move forward. And so maybe there's a job, an opening that comes up, and they would be the perfect person for it, but they have to say, no, I can't. Right now is not the best time in my life. And again, that has that compounding effect for them. So you really want to be thinking about that. I think the other thing that we, just to like kind of help some people decide like how could they approach that. So if they're listening to this and they're like, yeah, I definitely have too much on my plate. One of the things that I would encourage people to do is talk to whoever does the HR, human resources, at your job, and find out what options are available for you, either that employer offers, or there could be some state protections or some federal protections. So one is the Family Medical Leave Act. And that covers some people who are at larger employers. And it does allow people to take off work to care for an aging parent. And so there's some protections there. So if you work at a larger place, that could apply to you. Now, that does not give you pay. What it does, what the Family Medical Leave Act really was designed to do, is to secure the fact that you have a job. And so it's not going to help with, the health insurance you talked about, or paying their own electric bill, but at least it makes sure that their job's still there.
Well, and I think too, that's why I think we see a lot of people still looking for like remote jobs and different things like that. Because typically with a remote job, there's a little bit more flexibility of, especially if you're out of town and you have to travel to caregive, you can kind of do that job from anywhere. But I think, one of the things I want people to get from this is, one, they should speak to their HR. I totally agree with that. But then also just being open and honest with your manager. We can't speak for everybody in the US. We can't speak for all managers. But I think, I like to believe that most people are good and most people want to help, but your manager...
It's a hard belief right now in our society, but I'm with you.
It is, but I try to hold on to it. But I think, they can't help you if they don't know. And so I like to think that if we give, people the opportunity to do the right thing, that they will do it. Maybe that's my optimism showing through, or myself as a manager. It's how I choose to kind of approach things. But I think people, if you don't say anything, you end up being resentful of your employer, especially as the business continues to move on and the demands get higher. I also think, as somebody who went to undergrad, went to grad school, got a professional designation, there is like an emotional component, and I want people to like sit in that for a little bit of, if you have to pass up a promotion, it's okay to be upset about that. Like, I also think, like, just because the decision that you make is for caregiving and is not to take that promotion, just because you're upset that you didn't get that doesn't mean that it's the wrong decision to make, right? Everybody has to make the decisions that are best for them. If you choose to take that promotion because you worked really hard for it, that's also okay. Neither one of us is sitting here telling you what decisions you should make. We're just reading statistics about decisions that other people have made, sharing the decisions that we made. None of them are perfect, and they all come with emotions attached to them, whether that be good, bad, or indifferent.
Well, I think part of what we're saying is a decision needs to be made. Like, you can't just keep moving forward and acting like it's all okay. There is a new normal. I know some people don't like to hear that, but I that really resonates with me, that like I had to switch to a new normal. And whatever decisions are made, there's going to be something that you regret or some consequence. So whether you decide to take the promotion and not be available for caregiving, or whether you are available for caregiving and you turn down their promotion. And that resentment you talked about can go to your employer. It can be how you feel about your own life. But that resentment also can go back to your family because, maybe you did turn down that promotion and you did that. And please know, I don't want to in any way put aside the fact that, people caregive because they feel a sense of obligation, a good sense of obligation. I certainly felt that with my mom. She had done so much to raise me. There was so much in my life that I had to thank her for. I would have never gotten through law school without her. So I definitely wanted to be there for her. And I definitely didn't feel like I needed to be paid for that. But what we're talking about, and I wasn't, but what we're talking about is a situation where caregiving is hard. And you can't just say, okay, I'm going to do this and keep doing everything else that I've been doing. There's an old saying, and I forget who says it, but like, you can have everything, just not all at once. And so I'm a big believer that there's chapters in our lives, and some chapters are about caregiving for children, and some chapters about caregiving for aging parents, and that has an effect on that chapter. It has an effect on taking vacations and being there for your own grandchildren and your own health. And I think what these statistics point out is that there's a reality to that, And I think as a society, we're behind in all of this. Now, there are some states that have laws: California, Colorado, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, and Washington, plus the District of Columbia, have laws that actually provide, mandatory paid time off for caregivers through family leave insurance programs. Other states, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Kentucky, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, and West Virginia have voluntary programs in place. And so I urge people to kind of look into, are you covered by the Family Medical Leave Act? Do you work in a state where there's some either mandatory or voluntary protections for you that really has a mindset of this is hard and we need to help our employees through this? I think that's really important for people to be thinking about. And again, I hit on, talking to other family members. But it all starts, I think, first with a recognition of where you're at and where you're going. And honestly, Court, we know that that's really hard because sometimes that is acknowledging that your loved one is declining.
Mom, I think that's a good point, is that, people who are caregivers, it's really hard to kind of come to the emotional terms of that they're caregiving. And they wouldn't be listening to this podcast. They wouldn't be doing all of this if they didn't care about somebody, if they didn't care about the outcome of what they were doing. And I think that's what makes it so hard, is that, we live in a society where they say that, like, you should be able to do it all. You can have it all, right? I think especially as women, right? Like, how many times do you see, like, all of this stuff where it's like, you can do it all, you can have it all. It's kind of crap. Like, you can do it all and have it all, just not at the same time, right? Like you said earlier. And I think it's such a detriment that we try to do it all and have it all at the same time. And then we end up getting frustrated at ourselves. But what we're doing is an impossible task. And that's why I kind of want to come back to something that we talked about in the beginning, which is, paying caregivers. And I think, there's a thought, or, neither one of us were paid caregivers when we did it for Nan. I, like you, felt like I owed that to Nan, as somebody who always made sure that, like, I had everything that I needed. I remember when I got my first internship at Ernst & Young in public accounting. And it was a really, really hard time in my life. I was having a really hard time with my college roommates at the time. We weren't really getting along. I was in a bad, relationship, and Nan and I didn't have any clothes. This is, your first job. You don't have
no clothes for Ernst & Young. You
right.
had clothes to go to class.
I did. I had,
I don't want the viewers to think like you didn't have any clothes, but you didn't have Ernst & Young.
I didn't have suits. And people think that that's funny, but I actually had a client, a construction client, that required that we wear suits. They delivered gravel, but God forbid we not be in a suit when we went to work. So yes, I had leggings and sweatshirts and all jeans, but nothing to go to work in. And she came up and she took me shopping and she got me all of the clothes that I needed, and that was really important to her, that when I showed up on the first day, I looked like I was supposed to be there, because she
definitely thought, look good, feel good, do good.
She did. And so, but if I had gotten paid to take her to the doctor, to take her to the grocery store, it doesn't make what I was doing any less valuable. And I think that's what I want, the listeners to really think about. We're really here to talk about employment, but we would be remiss if we didn't talk about, one of the ways to solve that is to be paid to be a caregiver, to make that your job. It doesn't make it any less important, and it doesn't make what you're doing any less emotional, or that, what you're doing is no less a good thing, or that in some ways those of us that were able to caregive without getting paid are any better at it or better for it than those people that are.
Yeah, because you're still, leaving a job or part of a job that is going to affect your advancement, affect all kinds of things. And I think, when you're talking, I'm just thinking about the fact that, if you are a caregiver and you're on here, for everything that you do, you should just hear thank you. Thanks for doing it, because you don't get a lot of thank yous. It is a thankless job. And often, I know myself, I spent a lot of my time wishing I had done it better, or focusing on the things I didn't get done, or the times that like I wasn't quite as organized as I should be. Or so I just think like, if you're listening, just like, let's just give a little pause, a little pat on your back and say, thanks for being willing to do this for your loved one. And your loved one may not be able to say that to you because, again, they're dealing with their own declining independence. They're dealing with all kinds of issues. And I'm sure that they're appreciative that you're there. They may not be able to verbalize that to you. And I think that that's, important for all of us to remember just how hard this is. One other statistic that, I'm just going to kind of caution again. So 72% report using telework when given the option by their employer in a response to caregiving. And please know, I think telework is great. I think all of the flexibility that we have today in many, many careers is wonderful. But what I would say to you is, if we're going to telework, but we still have the same obligations, you're not really reducing. I mean, yeah, you're not commuting back and forth, but sometimes telework is harder because you don't have that time for collaboration. And, it's all on you. You have to make sure that you have ways of communicating with people that you might be missing while you're in office. So I would say to you, just, I think that going to telework is a temporary solution for maybe a longer term problem. And that, yeah, you can try it, but be conscious of the fact that you still have the same obligations. Now, if you live in a city that, reducing that commute gives you hours a day, well then, yeah, absolutely. That buys you absolutely some time. But I think we're talking about more of a transition and a shift than something like that for how long this can all last.
No, I think that's a good point because I do work 100% remote. And so one of the ways that I, was able to like take off in the middle of the day and take Nan to the doctor while also keeping my job is I would give up like a Saturday morning and I would work on a Saturday. Well, that worked for me, right? Like I'm single, I don't have kids. Like I can pick up a Saturday morning.
I mean, Minnie would be.
Well, yeah, I do have a dog. And raising a dog takes a village, but
well, Minnie, it takes a village.
No,
but
the way that I do it for sure. So I think, what people have to understand is that if you're in a situation to move hours or, I think, all those years in public accounting, I actually sometimes can hit a really, good groove at like 10 o'clock at night. That's not something you can do.
No. I'd be better off to get up at 4 a.m.
Right.
There's no groove at 10 o'clock for me.
But I was still responsible for all of the same things. So, but I lived 7.5 hours away from Nan. So the ability to go home for a week and, do things with her and then just shift things from week to week. But there's still a conversation with my employer that had to happen, which is, I also now, like during the workday, I'm going to go do these couple of things. There's still things that are happening that like deadlines might have to get shifted. Things are going to have to be flexible. I might not make a 2:00 meeting. So I agree with you. I think telework or remote work, I think it can be a great tool. But if you don't reduce the burden or you just tell them that you're going remote and you don't have this larger conversation about, and it's because I'm caregiving and therefore like all of these other things are going to happen. I also think, people have to be, realistic about what can happen in the decision-making process. And I felt this more in grief, I think, than I did in caregiving. And I don't know that it's because it didn't happen when I was caregiving. I think I was just more aware of it. But I would get to the point where I just couldn't think anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think, there's grief all through this process. And to think that like the months after Nan passed away, that it just didn't take me longer to do things. Just because my brain, like I just couldn't think. And these are conversations you have to be having with your employer. And so I think, it would be, if you're sitting here and you're like, I don't even know how to have this conversation, obviously we don't speak for everybody. We don't speak for every manager. And I'm not saying that we're perfect managers, but, we we've successfully managed some people. I think just, both of us sharing, if somebody came to us, like you shared in the beginning about Lori coming to you, like if somebody came to you and they were caregiving, what would you want them to say to you?
Yeah, I think the best thing for people to do is to start the conversation. For me, just kind of being honest about where they're at and how they can approach work so that we can find the best solution for them and for the business itself, I think is really, really important. And I would encourage people to start that conversation, even if you're saying, oh, I can still do it right now. Because the important thing is knowing, like, is there going to be flexibility? Is there not? Like, what is the employer's response going to be to it? Because you could make other decisions, like to change your job, before it gets to a point that like you really, really can't. And so I always think, even if you find out bad information or what you feel like is like, oh, this is not going to be an option, I think having that information is really, really powerful because it gives you the ability to make a different choice in your life. And I think that's really important. One of the things I actually just said at a staff meeting with, some of my staff is, and we're an elder law firm, so we deal with people who are caregiving. And one of the quotes that I just always kind of has stuck with me is that the best we can do for people is being effective in helping them. So the best that you can do for your loved one that you're caring for is be effective in helping them. And you can only be effective if you have the time, the time to actually do the caregiving, the time to figure out answers, the need for a plan for, not just reacting to what is happening right now, but building a plan so you can respond to changes. There's a huge difference in life between reacting to whatever is going on and being able to respond to it. And that's where you want to get in caregiving. You want to be able to not just react to the crisis of the day or the week and what's going on, but to be able to say, okay, here's where I'm at. Here's what this diagnosis is. Here's what I'm going to be able to expect. I kind of am getting my ducks in a row. Here's what I can do now. Here's what's going to be needed later. And communicate that with family and or get other paid caregivers and decide how this is going to look. So that as people decline, you're able to respond to that. You're able to kind of put the pieces into play versus, again, having this other crisis that we react to. Because I think it's funny, Court, when you were talking about the fact that you couldn't think afterwards, I was sitting here thinking, oh, I'm so glad to hear that. That's horrible of me, but I just thought it was me and my age, like going through menopause and I can't think about anything. But glad to hear it happened to you, the younger version. But I think that's what happens is that, sometimes people are reacting and it's not going to be the best reaction because you're just getting through the day and it's not kind of thought through. And what I can say to everybody, because at my office on a daily basis, we're helping people through this. We're helping them navigate these journeys that can be really difficult. It can be better. It can be better. It's better to take time off of work and decide that you're going to go visit 3 nursing homes, 3 assisted living facilities, start looking about what is possible if mom or dad can't stay at home, or start to interview care agencies, like lay that groundwork. It is better than waiting until you're at the ICU room hospital, the waiting room. Mom's had a stroke and what are we going to do? Or worse, and this happens all the time, you get sick. Mm-hmm. And now we don't have the caregiver who could tell us the best. And we now have a person that we have to care for anyways. And we're making decisions that they're not a part of, And so I hear from families all the time that my mom won't accept help, or my mom won't, or dad, will never move out of that house. And you, just so you know, you can go start figuring out what the options are ahead of time. and deciding, what could be an option if something happens. And they can be part of that, which is wonderful, but they also don't have to be part of that in the beginning stages. Of course, it's their life and it's their choices. But that's something that's, definitely going to be worth the time later on when you're forced to make decisions that you don't want to make, but have to be made.
Yeah. And so I think, everybody listening, this journey can happen fast, it can happen slow, and you have no control over that. So when you get the first inclination, I think planning, when there is no plan, when you're not sure what you're going to need, it's better to have 2 different plans for different sets of circumstances that you're kind of able to pick from at any given time. And, even with our advice about talking to employers, which is doing it early, do it early so that you know what your options are. You also, doing it early, if you've been somebody who's consistently come to work, who's done a good job, if you come at that conversation, there's more probably goodwill from the employer before they've had to write you up a couple of times because you've been late to work and they didn't know. So at that point in time, it's a very different conversation because there's more stress around it because you're like, I know I haven't been doing a good job. And that's just stress and guilt and all of kinds of emotions that we don't want you to have if you would just have that conversation early. And I think going back to then the caregiving and making the plan, I just think it's so important for people. The first step is to identify where you're at, even if you're not emotionally ready to accept it, so that you can start planning so that when a crisis do happen, and because they're going to happen, there's going to be a crisis in caregiving. There's even going to be small ones where, you've scheduled a doctor's appointment, you've gotten everything lined up, and then the doctor's running an hour and a half late.
Or your loved one is really sick that day
and can't go.
Or like Nan, she called and canceled it that morning because she thought that, she wasn't going to go that day, that she, even though I took the day off of work, there's all those variables. I think though, that's one of the reasons that we made the Caregiver Toolkit. Is if you're sitting here hearing this and you're thinking, well, where do I start? That's something very concrete that it talks about, what decisions are going to have to be made. What could you look into? And really, you could start anywhere in that toolkit and move forward and just start laying some groundwork so that at the end of the day, you are able to respond to what is happening rather than react to it.
And so for everybody listening, you can get the Caregiver Toolkit at planningandprotecting.com. So head on over to planningandprotecting.com and there's a toolkit. You can print it out in sections or you can print out the whole toolkit. And I strongly encourage you to kind of go through that with your loved one and start to collect information. It's a lot of information to collect. And so doing it all at one time can be really hard. So we encourage you to do it in pieces. There are podcast episodes where we talk about some of the sections. I'm sure there'll be more podcast episodes where we talk about the sections we haven't talked about yet. Also on the planningandprotecting.com website, there are attorneys that could be in your local area. If there isn't an attorney in your state that's listed, you can reach out. There's contact information on that site to reach out and we can see if we can get you connected to somebody that's not listed. But anybody listed there would be able to have these conversations with you, help you even, we've talked about foundational legal documents. They can help you with that. They would be able to help you with, caregiver agreements, should you get paid. And if you haven't listened to some of the episodes we did with Dawn Quante too, there could be financial products that maybe could help alleviate the financial burden. So there's a lot of really, really great information. So I encourage you guys to go there. Also follow along on TikTok, on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. We're posting a lot of really great information. And so we hope to help make this journey a little bit better. But I think, if you're wrapping up listening to this, the one thing is if you think that you should talk to your employer or you think that some of this has resonated with you, it probably is time to schedule a meeting with HR and just open that conversation, because the earlier you do some of this stuff, the better off you'll be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also just want to, let everybody know, I know some may have heard about, reaching out to an attorney and oh, why would I want to talk to an attorney? Because there's so many gaps and voids in this country, in this caregiver journey. a lot of elder law attorneys have kind of stepped in and said, we can help with this because we see it day to day. And so, not every attorney is going to be the same, but the people that are on the Planning and Protecting website are people who are going to approach this from the same angle that I do, and the same perspective. Many were caregivers themselves, but they've helped countless families understand what the journey what the journey looks like ahead, and will help you make a plan so that you're able to respond.